first full-time job I'd ever held. Aware that I had some growing up to do, I found myself looking around for a model, a wise, successful adult from whom I could learn. My college friends who had joined corporations, banks, and law firms had already found their models. They were studying the savviest managers in their corporations, the richest directors in their banks, and the suavest partners in their law firms. Whom could I study? It made no sense to model myself on the other speechwriters. Most of them were only in their 30s. For a while, I thought myself unlucky. Then I realized I might as well have won the 20-something lottery. My model could be Ronald Reagan. I began studying the president not just to write speeches for him, but to figure out how he did it. That question, how did Reagan do it, is worth dwelling upon. I found myself asking it in one form or another until the day I left the White House. I still remember where I was and how I felt the first time I found myself asking it, which was the first time I saw the president in person. A couple of weeks after joining the office of the vice president, where I worked for a year and a half before joining the president's staff, I found myself huddled late one evening with Chase Untermeyer, an advisor to Vice President Bush, in Chase's tiny office in the West Wing. Exhausted, we'd put in a long day, Chase and I were struggling to rewrite a speech I'd drafted. Out of the corners of our eyes, we saw a group of men striding down the hallway toward us. Somewhere in the background a vacuum cleaner was droning away, and I suppose if at that very instant you'd asked us to identify the men in the hallway, we'd have replied that they were part of the janitorial staff. Suddenly, we realized that two members of the group were Secret Service agents, while the third, walking between them, was the President of the United States. Just outside Chase's office, the hallway down which the President and the agents were walking joined a second hallway, forming an L. When the lead agent, who was a few steps ahead of the President, reached the corner of the L, he performed a neat right-angled turn, entering the second hallway. A moment later, the President and the other agent began turning into the second hallway themselves. Then the President spotted Chase and me. In a single, graceful movement, he adjusted direction, stepping to the door of Chase's office. He put his head in the door, grinned, waved, and gave us a wink. Before Chase or I could stand up, much less say anything, the President stepped back into the hallway and disappeared, taking the second agent with him. That little encounter with the President won't show up in any history book, needless to say. It didn't even make for much of a story when I telephoned my parents that night. They couldn't understand why I hadn't shaken the President's hand and told him who I was. But 20 years later, I can still replay the encounter in my mind as if in slow motion. The grin, the wave, the wink. Afterward, Chase and I felt better. We felt refreshed. The sheer sweetness of the man had washed over us like a bath. Turning to Chase, I asked, "How did such a nice guy ever get to be president?" How indeed. Politicians ordinarily demonstrate at least a rough congruence or fit between their personalities and their careers. Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon may have had their virtues, but they were also crude, aggressive, and suspicious. If politics were a greasy pole, you could imagine just how they had hauled themselves to the top. Even John Kennedy and Jimmy Carter possessed a kind of suppressed intensity that made it possible to understand how they had achieved their political success. Ronald Reagan, he seemed altogether too genial and relaxed. When Jack Warner, Reagan's old boss at Warner Brothers, was told that Reagan was running for governor of California, Warner misunderstood. "No," Warner replied, thinking the conversation was about a new movie, not a political campaign. "Jimmy Stewart for governor, Ronald Reagan for best friend." When I found myself wondering how such a nice guy ever got to be president, I had merely encountered that question, how did Reagan do it, in one of its many guises. How did a former movie actor persuade the American people to take him seriously? How did someone who graduated from an obscure college in the Midwest, someone former Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford famously termed an amiable dunce, develop the most sweeping policy agenda since the New Deal? How did such a relaxed, genial man confront the Soviet Union so ruthlessly? For that matter, how did a chief executive in his 70s stand up to the simple physical demands of the office? One year we kept the President waiting for the final text of the State of the Union address until 8 o'clock in the evening, just an hour before he had to deliver it. I remember imagining my state of mind if I'd been waiting for the speech myself. That was easy. I'd have been having a panic attack, sweaty palms, dry mouth, heart palpitations. By the time I received the text, I'd have been in no condition to deliver it. But the President? He calmly reviewed the text in his limousine during the ride to Capitol Hill, then went before both houses of Congress and tens of millions of TV viewers to deliver the 45-minute address flawlessly. The next morning, he arrived at the Oval Office looking just the way he always did, which is to say as fresh and at ease as if he'd just put in a couple of hours at a health club. How did Reagan do it? I wasn't sure at first I'd ever get any answers to the question. I couldn't get a purchase on Reagan. He seemed too much larger than life. There were days when I felt I might as well have chosen to model myself on one of the faces on Mount Rushmore. Then, although he never ceased to elicit my awe, he gradually began assuming the dimensions of an ordinary mortal. Eventually I came to see him not only as a former movie star, as the leader of the free world, and as the great communicator, but as a man. An incident comes to mind here. When in 1986 the President returned from the hospital after undergoing cancer surgery, the then Chief of Staff, Ronald Reagan, arranged for him to address the entire White House staff in the East Room. Reagan wanted us to see that the President was back to normal. It almost worked. The President spoke just as well as he always did. He even had that old twinkle in his eye. But he'd lost so much weight that his shirt collar was 2 sizes too big. If you ever need proof that someone who seems larger than life is human after all, look at the gap between his neck and his collar after he's had a bout with cancer. Once I understood that he had no more good health, stamina, or time than any other person, I began to see how Reagan did it. I realized, for instance, that although the President made a show of taking a relaxed approach to his job, "I know hard work never hurt anyone," he once quipped, "but I figure, why take a chance?" He actually worked steadily. Whereas Vice President Bush often wouldn't get around to looking at a speech until he was actually delivering it, the President edited every draft the speechwriter sent to him, condensing material, enlivening flat passages, and firming up arguments. Reagan's diligence informs Chapter 2 of this book. I learned the extent to which the President relied on his wife, drawing on her for comfort and encouragement, the observation to which Chapter 7 is devoted. I saw one incident after another in which Reagan demonstrated the gentleness, courtesy, and good humor that inform Chapter 9. Hard work, a good marriage, a certain lightness of touch. The longer I studied Ronald Reagan, the more lessons I learned. Oh, all right, I'll come clean. I landed in the White House on a fluke. In the spring of 1982, I found myself living in a dank cottage on the outskirts of Oxford, England. I'd attended Oxford for 2 years after graduating from Dartmouth, then remained in England an additional year to write a novel, or rather, half a novel. My material proved so bad that even I saw no point in completing it. Broke, I sent letters to everyone I thought might be able to give me a lead on a job. William F. Buckley, Jr. was among those who replied. This was gracious of him. The only claim I could make on Buckley's attention was that he'd complimented a couple of pieces I'd published in the Daily Dartmouth. Buckley suggested that I get in touch with his son, Christopher, who, as chief speechwriter for Vice President Bush, might know of a few speechwriting jobs in Washington. This was more than gracious of him. It was the only lead I received. At the beginning of July, I packed up my cottage, took a bus to Heathrow Airport, and flew to Washington. 2 days later, I presented myself at the office of Christopher Buckley. What did I expect? At best, I thought, Christopher might offer me a few polite words of advice, then make some telephone calls on my behalf. I distinctly recall concluding that I'd be lucky if Christopher helped me land a job with the Postmaster General. Instead, Christopher surprised me. He was planning to leave his own job in a couple of weeks, he explained, and since his replacement, who had been lined up for months, had just pulled out, I might as well replace him myself. Me? Write for the Vice President? Now the author of 5 comic novels, a collection of satirical essays, and other works of humor, Christopher had probably detected amusing possibilities the moment I walked through his door. He took a copy of my resume, promised to recommend me to the Vice President's press secretary, then suggested I go downstairs to meet the President's chief speechwriter, Tony Dolan, who might know of a few speechwriting jobs himself. As I was introducing myself to Tony 5 minutes later, his telephone rang. "You need a speechwriter?" Tony said into the telephone, shoving the unlit cigar he'd been chomping to one corner of his mouth. Covering the mouthpiece, Tony whispered that the person on the other end was the campaign manager for Lou Lehrman, the businessman then running against Mario Cuomo for governor of New York. "It so happens I have a speechwriter standing right here," Tony said, speaking back into the telephone. "No, really. Christopher Buckley just sent him down." When he hung up, Tony saw no more reason why I shouldn't write speeches for a gubernatorial candidate than Christopher had seen why I shouldn't write speeches for the vice president. That afternoon, Christopher and Tony conspired. And then, the following day, they put their plan into effect. Christopher told the vice president's press secretary that he'd found a new replacement, namely me, but that he'd better hire me quickly because I was being wooed by the Lehrman campaign. Tony told the Lehrman campaign that I was just the speechwriter they needed, but that they'd better hire me quickly because I was being wooed by the vice president's staff. You couldn't accuse Christopher or Tony of telling whoppers. Not exactly, anyway. As soon as they'd spun them, their tales became true. Both the vice president's staff and the Lehrman campaign did begin wooing me. Over the next couple of weeks, the Lehrman campaign flew me to New York 3 times, while the vice president's press secretary had me return to the old executive office building for a series of interviews. Each convinced that the other was about to hire me, neither the Bush staff nor the Lehrman campaign made any effort to investigate my qualifications. As best I can recall, nobody even bothered to ask for a writing sample. When the Bush staff and the Lehrman campaign both made offers, I decided to go to work for the vice president. Whereas Lehrman might never become governor, I reasoned, Bush would remain vice president for at least 2 more years. Noble motives? I wanted job security. You see my point, of course. I got a job as a White House speechwriter without ever having written a speech in my life. And that wasn't all. When I left the office of the vice president to join the president's speechwriting shop a year and a half later, I was able to do so only because 2 of the president's speechwriters had quit at the same time, forcing Bentley Elliott, then director of presidential speechwriting, to scrounge for replacements. He hired me because I was already in the building. Which brings me back to my qualifications for writing this book. Serving for 6 years as a speechwriter gave me the opportunity to conduct a close, continuous study of one of the largest and most magnificent Americans in the history of the Republic. Landing in the White House on a fluke made me conscious that I'd better do just that. In working on this book, I conducted several dozen interviews, refreshing my memory by talking with my old colleagues in the speechwriting shop, with other members of the White House staff, and with Ronald Reagan's sons, Michael and Ron. Dialogue from these interviews, which I've edited only for grammar and clarity, you'll hear for the most part in the present tense. Dialogue set during the 1980s, by contrast, you'll hear in the past tense. Some of this dialogue, including many of the comments by the president himself, is based on notes I made at the time, scribbling either on a legal pad during office hours or in my journal after I'd gone home. But some is based on my memory alone. If Ronald Reagan had been like Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon, I'd have been able to check a lot of this dialogue against the tape recordings he'd have had made. But if Ronald Reagan had been like Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon, he wouldn't have been Ronald Reagan. Although it took me a while to sit down and start writing, I can tell you precisely when I conceived of this volume, while watching the evening news of February 6, 2001. My oldest child, then 9 and a half, happened to wander into the room during a segment marking Ronald Reagan's 90th birthday. She watched for a moment. Then she turned to me and asked, "Dad, is that the president you worked for?" What answer could I give her? How could I make her see? I wanted my daughter to recognize that the world she inhabited was freer and more prosperous because of that old man on television. But I also wanted her to grasp my personal debt to him, understanding all that he taught me. How to work and how to relax, how to think and how to use words, how to be a good husband, how to approach life itself. Although my parents, her grandparents, taught me more than anyone else, I found myself wanting to explain, I encountered Ronald Reagan at that impressionable moment when I had stepped out on my own for the first time. As I worked for him, he shaped me. My experience in the White House had always been so much a part of me that I'd taken it for granted. Now I saw that for the sake